Hello there. Welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, it is 6 months until the presidential election. We'll take a close look at the state of the polls and the state of the race with the Cook Report's Dave Wasserman.
And we're going to have an update on the Trump hush money trial with criminal defence expert Anna Cominsky. But first...
In a major policy shift, President Joe Biden has announced the United States will not provide thousands of bombs and artillery shells to the Israeli military if they push ahead with a planned attack on the southern Gazan city of Rafah.
If they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem.
This pause Biden has announced is not the first time an American president has withheld military supplies from Israel to express their displeasure or to try and force a change in Israeli strategy. Back in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan more than once delayed shipments of warplanes and other munitions out of dissatisfaction with the Israeli intervention in neighbouring Lebanon. But Joe Biden's decision has taken many in Washington by surprise, Republicans in particular, including House Speaker Mike Johnson, who worked with Biden to secure billions of dollars in aid for Israel. Johnson telling Politico that he hoped that Biden was having a senior moment and that he hopes and believes Biden was off script. Well, that does seem very unlikely because Biden had already told the Israelis that he would be pausing aid. So this is a very high stakes game. Clearly, Mike Johnson and other Republicans are not at all happy. A very difficult needle for Biden to be trying to thread right now, politically in Washington, as well as, of course, with the situation on the ground in the Middle East itself.
Yeah, look, they're placing Biden under a lot of pressure at the moment for this decision, even though Biden has made it very clear he's going to continue to supply defensive munitions. And this is just a pause of a week so far. He just doesn't want the big bombs that Biden believes have no role to play in an unevacuated city.
And which Biden has conceded as well. American bombs have already killed Palestinian civilians, and he's not comfortable with that.
Absolutely. Well, nevertheless, Republicans are getting a stabbed in the back narrative going at the moment.
Do you believe Iran really wants to kill all the Jews if they could? The Iranian regime, yeah. Do you believe Hamas is serious when they say we'll keep doing it over and over again? Do you agree that they will if they can?
I do. Hamas,
okay, right. Do you believe that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization also bent on the destruction of the Jewish state?
Hezbollah is a terrorist organization.
Okay, so Israel's been hit in the last few weeks by Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, dedicated to their destruction. And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews?
Of course, we should remember Americans been defending them that entire time, and Biden did call for evacuations of Rafah the whole time, and Netanyahu was going, yeah, and he just wasn't doing it.
Yeah.
So you can see this standoff. There's a lot of confusion as well about what exactly do Israel want to do. Like, Lindsey Graham assumes they just all speak one voice, but it's not like Israel is united on these questions. For instance, last week at Israel's War Cabinet meeting, Netanyahu wanted to start the military operation in Rafah as soon as possible, but everyone present at the meeting objected to his proposal, and it was rejected. Now they say that they're all on the same page. Are they? We don't know. What are the internal numbers right now in the War Cabinet? There's also a distinct lack of trust between Biden and Netanyahu. Recall, Netanyahu promised repeatedly that he was going to evacuate. Like I said, nothing so far. Well, 100,000 people. That leaves 1.3 million people trapped like sardines in this city, and that's what Biden's worried about. Comments like this, by the way, from Likud member of the Knesset, Tali Gottlieb, do not help at all.
ארצות הברית מאיימת שלא תיתן לנו טילים מדויקים. וואלה, יש לי חדשות לארצות הברית. יש לנו טילים לא מדויקים. ויש לנו את הזכות להתגונן. אז אולי במקום להשתמש בטיל מדויק ולהוריד חדר ספציפי, או בניין ספציפי, אני אשתמש בטילים הלא מדויקים שלי, ואני פשוט אמוטט 10 בניינים. 10 בניינים. 10 בניינים. זה מה שאני אעשה.
I mean, that is confirming the worst fears of the people who oppose arming Israel, those kinds of clips there. Meanwhile, Biden isn't being straightforward himself, because while he's putting a hold on these munition sales, at the same time, He's sabotaging back in America attempts to control other weapons transfers. You see, there's a law in America called the Lay Act. It's been around since 1997. It prohibits the US Defense and State Departments from rendering security assistance to foreign governments facing credible accusations of rights abuses. Now, the knock on the Lay Act over the last 30 years has been it doesn't seem to apply to Israel. Israel never get hauled up according to the Lay Act, but there's other ones. There's a Foreign Assistance Act, which does the same thing as well. Biden put out a memo earlier this year, same thing as well. They were about to put out a report, as asked for by the Biden memo, about human rights abuses from Israel using American weapons. That report went missing this week. It was due this week, and they just, gosh darn it, the dog ate that report. So the Biden administration is still running interference for Israel on the other weapons. And it's not really clear who's helping who, where everyone's at. It's just confusion and mistrust and people trying to politic. And it's just not helpful.
And Israel has been talking for 3 months now about an imminent invasion of Rafah, and it has been this big sort of threat about, meet our requirements for conditions for a ceasefire, or we're going in to the last Hamas stronghold, but there's incredibly densely populated areas, as you now point out. It is, of course, also the gateway to the Gaza Strip from Egypt. So now that the border has been closed by a limited Israeli military incursion into the border zone, it means that there is no escape route, to the south at least, just back to the north. And there is no humanitarian aid coming through the Rafah crossing either. So when it comes to human rights abuses, well, there's a huge one brewing right now, whether Israel launches a full-on street-by-street urban assault on Rafah or not. And as for Joe Biden, they say you can't please all of the people all the time. Well, unfortunately for him right now, he's pleasing none of the people none of the time, because this is not enough for the pro-Palestinian progressive base of his Democratic Party. And this is clearly antagonising potentially the sort of national security independents and Republicans, the Lindsey Graham types who may be anti-Trump on this, but they are definitely pro-Israel on all of this. So Joe Biden is in quite a bind right now, and he can only hope that the sort of stop-start process we've seen towards that ceasefire, which at the start of the week was looking very, very close, but then when Hamas said, yes, we accept your terms for a ceasefire, they then did the translation, had a look and said, oh, you've accepted a bunch of terms that we did not have as a part of that agreement. So the two sides drifted apart. They're still engaged in those talks, but they're looking less and less likely. So once again, we've gotten close to a ceasefire and a hostage swap, and then we've pulled back. The question is, how big is the incursion from Israel into Rafah in the next week, given that America has basically said, these bombs aren't going to make a difference to whether Israel can attack Rafah or not. This is a purely symbolic gesture, but it does say to Netanyahu, we think enough is enough. We're kind of drawing a red line here, and we're saying for you to do that kind of an attack on Rafah is going to see a massive civilian casualty toll. And, the State Department believes that they are saving Netanyahu from himself, because the international pressure that we brought to bear on Israel, if they kill another 10 or 20,000 civilians in Rafah in the weeks ahead, is going to be immense. They're in danger of losing the PR war, even if they manage to win the war against Hamas. Well, back on Capitol Hill, Speaker Mike Johnson survived a long-threatened attempt to oust him by a small group of Conservatives led by Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene this week. In the end, she could only muster 11 Republican votes to unseat Johnson after all that. And on top of that, she was booed from both sides of the aisle when she made her fateful move.
The form of the resolution is as follows. Declaring the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives to be vacant. This is the uniparty for the American people watching.
Gentlelady will suspend.
For those of you thinking the uniparty is something that involves some pot and a keg of beer, no. It's her description of Republicans who side with Democrats to pass budget bills and provide foreign aid to countries like Israel. She has become quite isolated, though, in all of this, even losing the support of former President Trump, who she claims to represent. Trump took to Truth Social to urge Republicans to support Mike Johnson and to vote for the motion to table, which was the maneuver by which they were able to kill off Marjorie Taylor Greene's attempt to oust him. Here's what he said.
Mike Johnson is a good man who is trying very hard. I also wish certain things were done over the last period of 2 months, but we will get them done together. It is my request that Republicans vote for the motion to table.
Now, that truth made it look like they were following Trump's orders, except that his message was actually sent out after the vote had been finalised. So it was kind of like saying, oh, that horse just went across the finish line. I'm going to put my money on that. That is a funny observation. But to be fair, I'm sure they all gossip enough about what Trump thinks to know that Trump apparently called Marjorie Taylor Greene days ago and told her to lay off. Yeah. And she's gotten such airs, she ignored Trump and went ahead anyway. It was a bit of a stop-start process. On Wednesday, it looked like she wasn't going to do it. On Thursday, she suddenly did it. So who knows what she's thinking? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do feel like sometimes she's got delusions of grandeur. Like she apparently made a bunch of demands to Mike Johnson in return for him for not calling this motion. One of them was to get him to defund the entire Department of Justice because of Trump's criminal charges. I mean, that's never going to happen. And Thomas Massey, who's really been kind of the main sort of egger-honor of Marjorie through all of this, he was putting in conditions of his own, saying we're going to cut 1% from every single thing that comes before us. We're going to get this budget. It was just these arbitrary ambit claims. I mean, the bottom line is if they can call everyone who went against them the Union Party, but in that case, the Union Party is the entirety of Congress. Yeah, right. So hopefully, Marjorie Taylor Greene might have learned a lesson from that the days of her being very special might be over, at least for the short term, and that she's now just one member of Congress again. Yeah, could well be. With former President Trump pretty preoccupied with his ongoing criminal hush money trial in New York, and President Biden spending a lot of his time trying to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, a lot of the attention this week in the presidential campaign shifted to independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr, and the media has been doing a lot of digging, particularly into his past, and it turns out into his brain, where they found a worm. Seriously. A worm in his brain. Kennedy says that he was experiencing severe memory loss and mental fog in 2010 and consulted neurologists, and that's when they found the parasite.
And that's not all. Bobby Kennedy Jr. also says he suffers from mercury poisoning that he believes was a result of eating too much tuna. Tuna fish sandwiches, it turns out. In fact, experts say that despite the worm having eaten part of Bobby Jr.'s brain or fluids from the brain tissue, it was probably the mercury that caused the cognitive problems that he complained about experiencing more than a decade ago. He hasn't released any updated medical records, but he says he's fine now. In fact, he offered to eat 5 more brain worms and still beat President Trump and President Biden in a debate. That's a good line. That is a pretty good comeback. There are plenty of background pieces, though, probing into Kennedy's beliefs, his health, his lifestyle, his history of addiction, and even the suicide of his ex-wife, Mary Richardson, which came during a protracted divorce proceeding. And Kennedy got a bit of a grilling this week on the left-wing MSNBC network. He was accused of creating a false equivalency between Biden and Trump, saying they're as bad as each other. And he was also kind of positioning himself in an interesting way for this campaign as being above the political fray. And he says the answer to the deep divisions in the United States. Take a look.
It is more vitriolic, more polarized, more poisonous than at any time since the American Civil War. And it's all being amplified by the social media algorithms. And it's hard to see a way out of that if somebody doesn't come along and say, I'm not going to participate in that. And even if people act crazy on both sides, I'm not going to be part of that craziness.
That is the sweet spot for Kennedy, that message.
It would seem to be, but it's hard to know what the voters make of all of that right now. Yesterday, there was a poll from YouGov that had Kennedy on just 3% support, with Biden and Trump tied on 43 apiece. On Tuesday, there was a tip poll, and it gave Kennedy 12% support, with Biden just 1 point ahead of Trump. In the average of polls on 538.com, Kennedy is getting about 10% support, so it is significant. He's certainly not typically down there with Cornel West and Jill Stein, not quite in the Ross Perot territory, but potentially a major factor. But this is an important inflection point because he's getting scrutiny as a potentially key player in this election, potentially somebody who could make it onto that debate stage with his 5 brain worms. He needs 15% to do that, so he's a little short of that right now. Question is, with the scrutiny and the attention, do people like what they see? and his numbers go up, or do they hear this stuff about a brainworm and a messy divorce and a whole bunch of stuff in his past that could be a bit distasteful?
Look, this is traditionally when the third-party candidates tend to start losing support, when people start to get serious about the election. So that there may be a natural glide down anyway, like has happened in the past. As far as the brainworm goes, I really should just put it out there. It's not a big deal. It sounds like a big deal, but it's actually, as far as the world goes, in poor countries, it's relatively common. Like there are millions of people around the world with inverted commas the brainworm, and like you can just get them from a pig farm or something like that, depending on the worm. You swallow eggs, they crawl around, the larvae crawl around looking for pig tissue. They don't find any. They end up just dying in your brain. They create a cyst and die in your brain. They're not actually eating your brain. There's just a cyst there, and then it's just there. It's gone. That's it. Like
when it was first identified on a scan as a dark mass on his brain, the first thought was brain cancer. At that time, his uncle Teddy Kennedy was dying of glioblastoma, and that was the fear. It took them a while to figure out that it was not that, but he was still claiming in depositions in that long divorce case that he was cognitively impaired, he had long and short-term memory loss issues, and therefore he wasn't able to earn a lot of money, and therefore couldn't pay a lot of alimony or a big settlement to his ex-wife.
Well, I was going to say that to me is actually, I mean, I don't think his divorce really matters for this election, but if I'm being critical of RFK Jr, it's why he was talking about this in the deposition, trying to stiff his kids for child support. I think that's more condemnable.
And he dragged it out for years, and the family, and not just RFK Jr, but Kerry Kennedy, others were visiting with his wife, and she ultimately ended her life. Now, whether that was something that she was likely to do or not, we don't know. But apparently, it was a particularly unpleasant situation.
Yeah, I want to leave that because that is, as you say, a very delicate situation. But just in all seriousness, when we're talking about, I don't think there's any mental problems with the brainworm thing. If we're worried about his mood and mood swings and so forth like that, I think what we should be focusing on, if anything, is if you have a look at him last year, look at that photo. This is a 70-year-old man. The guy says, I don't do steroids, I just take testosterone. Synthetic testosterone is steroids. He's a roider and he's 70. And that does have an effect on mood swings. Now, I don't think he's going to be president, so I don't actually really care. But if we're actually being reasonable about the things affecting his brain, I'd be more worried about the testosterone than I would about the brainworms, which are nothing.
Yeah, although, you know, some people would say, well, he has got some wacky ideas. And yes, there's a kind of inconsistency there. Oh, he's casting doubt over the safety of vaccines without a scientific basis, and yet he's pumping his body full of things that can be very bad for the human body as well. And if there's a cognitive issue there, it might explain that disconnect.
Yeah, look, there's certainly a delicious irony in that. I'll leave it at that. Meanwhile, Biden is still on the campaign trail. We should have Biden, the actual president. He's causing a stir with another new rule. Let me take you back to 2009 when Barack Obama spoke about his brand new Obamacare policy.
There are also those who claim that our reform efforts would ensure illegal immigrants. This, too, is false. The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally. It's not true.
That little call out you heard was a congressperson yelling out, "You lie!" And do you remember when that was the worst thing that people did at States of the Union? It seems so quaint today. But as it turns out, that heckler saying "you lie" was kind of right over the long term, because even though Obama himself explicitly in 2012 held that no illegal immigrants were allowed to access subsidised healthcare plans from Obamacare, Biden has now decided otherwise. He's opened up Obamacare plans to tens of thousands of immigrants who came to the United States as little kids but do not qualify for government health insurance because they still aren't officially legal residents. They're the so-called DACA kids, and by the way, they're now very adult. Anyway, while Democrats might think that's a good thing to do, Trump definitely disagrees, and it just so happens that this policy is the perfect example of the kind of thing Trump's been criticising through a super PAC ad just this week.
Hello, I'm with the Biden campaign.
Yeah, I voted for Biden last time.
That's fantastic.
Is it? Everything costs more. Food, gas, rent.
Okay, but Biden's helping pay rent for newcomers to America from around the world.
You mean illegal immigrants? I'm struggling to pay my bills, but Biden's paying rent for illegals? They get handouts and I'm paying for it.
But Biden can still count on your vote, right?
Things were better before Biden. I'm voting for Trump.
Make America Great Again, Inc. is responsible for the content of this advertising.
And I'm sure the Oscar is in the mail for that lady. And that ad ran in rural Georgia, targeting black men in particular, if that wasn't obvious from the voice on the phone. Let's talk polls, though. Chris Steiwalt, one of the better polling analysts out there, recently released a stock take of some of the classic polling questions, according to Gallup. And I thought I'd share them with you now, because they're quite interesting. Back in May 2020, 32% of people were satisfied with the way things were going in America. Doesn't sound great, and it was part of the reason Trump lost. Well, now it's 23% who are satisfied. Back in May 2020, 28% of the electorate identified as Republican and 31% as Democrats. Now it's 30% identifying as Republicans and 28% identifying as Democrats. Finally, in 2020, 56% of people were more than usually motivated to vote in the election, whereas 28% were less than usually motivated. Well, this year, the motivated people are about the same, but there are many more demotivated people, and that could help out Biden, because the likely voters tend to favour him. The demotivated ones aren't the likely voters. Finally, the polls are starting to come in about this Manhattan trial we've been talking about. And if Trump is found not guilty, he's in the lead by 2 points in this poll. But if he's found guilty without prison time, suddenly Biden's in the lead by 5 points. And if Trump gets prison time, then Biden's ahead by 8. Importantly, John, Biden's number doesn't change throughout. It's just pretty much the same.
Yep.
Trump just loses votes if he's found guilty. Now, whether they go to RFK or people stay at home, we'll find out. But this is obviously guesswork at the moment, largely. But nevertheless, food for thought, I think.
Yes, indeed. Let's get some more food on this as well. No shortage of punditry and prognosticators in American politics, and a lot of it is frankly based more on wishful thinking or ideology rather than a really good, solid analysis of the data and the electorate as well. One person who I think is very much the exception to the rule of a lot of poor punditry in the United States is Dave Wasserman from the Cook Political Report. He is something of an icon in nerdy circles. Pretty much, if an election is happening, everybody who's serious in the business is looking at Dave Wasserman's Twitter feed to see the magic words, "I've seen enough." Well, it's nice to see him joining us now from the state of Washington. Dave Wasserman, thanks for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Sure.
So, Dave, we have been seeing a lot of polls over recent months showing that Joe Biden is really struggling to gain the support of younger voters, whereas former President Trump is doing comparatively well, certainly for a Republican candidate. First of all, I wonder, do you believe those polls that you're seeing? And if so, how do you explain them?
I do believe these polls that we're seeing that show Joe Biden unusually weak with young voters, because the truth is there's never been a lot of young enthusiasm for Joe Biden. It's mostly been enthusiasm against Donald Trump. And the problems, the weakness that we've been seeing predate October 7th. And the war in Gaza has driven a wedge between Biden and the young progressive voters that he's going to need to ultimately vote against Trump. It's made it harder for Biden to get back to his 2020 levels of performance. And the exit polls 4 years ago showed that Biden carried voters 18 to 29 years of age 60 to 36% by 24 points. In our latest average of the crosstabs in these polls, Biden is only leading Trump 49 to 40%. That's not going to cut it, particularly in these key battleground states with higher numbers of younger participants.
Dave, we've seen in some polls that Israel's pretty unpopular amongst young voters, but then there are other polls, like, say, the Harvard Youth Poll, which suggests that Israel's actually a low-level issue for young voters. So which is it? Does the Gaza issue impact the youth support for Biden or not?
Yes, and Democrats are pointing to several polls that say that perhaps only 13 to 15% of young voters consider the situation in Gaza to be their top issue. But for that 13 to 15%, it could be a considerable depressing effect for support for Biden, and could make the difference between the numbers that Biden needs or not. And let's say that third-party candidates, whether it's RFK Jr. or more anti-war protest candidates such as Jill Stein, or simply movements to write in the words ceasefire on the ballot rather than voting for a major party candidate, let's say they take even 3 or 4% of the vote in places like Madison, Wisconsin, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Tempe, Arizona, in these college towns with big university populations that are progressive, that seriously precludes Biden from getting to his victory number in those critical states.
Dave, you talk about Joe Biden having always struggled to attract younger voters. But back in 2020, we did see record youth voter turnout in many parts of the country. Are you suggesting that both Biden and Trump may struggle to get younger voters out to the polls this year?
The key in 2020 was that it was more of a referendum on Trump, who was at a 41% approval rating after being widely perceived by voters to have mishandled COVID. And it wasn't really an election about Joe Biden. He was more of a transitional figure to move on from the chaos of the Trump era. Now, this is more of a choice election where voters have had a side-by-side comparison of the two candidates. And even though Joe Biden has made overtures to young voters on student loan forgiveness and climate change, keep in mind that a number of young voters are more culturally moderate or conservative, and some of them did not go to college. And we are seeing, I think, on the economy and pocketbook issues, voters across generations, including young voters, have more favorable perceptions of what the economy was like and what things cost under Trump's presidency than under Biden's. The saying here is that a $5 footlong sandwich at Subway has become a $6 6-inch. And to voters who are more simplistically comparing the two administrations and what they meant for their ability to obtain a mortgage, to buy their first home, or simply the cost of groceries or gas or healthcare, a number of voters are willing to overlook Trump's behavior and legal problems and indictments to go back to what the economy was like and what they remember about it under Trump's 4 years.
Okay, that's young voters. But a number of polls have shown Biden making significant inroads into Trump's support amongst over 65s. Do you think that's real? And if so, why might that be?
You know, the polls in 2020 also showed that Biden was performing relatively well with seniors. In the end, the evidence suggests that Biden and Trump ran evenly. Now, there were some trends that polls picked up in 2020 that were borne out in the results. For example, Trump performing much better with Hispanic and Latino voters. That was detected by pre-election surveys in 2020 and ended up being true. So what we're looking at in 2024, in our average of polls, Biden and Trump are running roughly evenly among seniors. And that is not much of a shift from what the exit polls showed 4 years ago. Biden's support appears to be holding up relatively well among older voters and with white voters. But basically, all of the erosion in Biden's support in the last 4 years appears to be coming from young voters and voters of color. The good news for Biden is that these are voters that he has won before and has a chance to bring back into the fold over the course of the next 6 months. But there's no guarantee it's going to happen, and he's pretty far off the mark of where he needs to be.
So these shifting demographics, Dave, are they just happening sort of around the margins, or are we seeing a fairly fundamental realignment of what age groups and what other demographics are supporting the two major parties?
These days, you can't just look at American politics on a left versus right spectrum. There's another axis that is important to pay attention to, and that's the engagement axis: high engaged voters versus low levels of more peripherally engaged voters. And what we're seeing is that Joe Biden and Democrats are doing best with the voters who are more reflexively paying attention to politics, those with higher levels of civic and institutional trust. It explains why Democrats have done very well in special elections and off years and midterm elections. But where Donald Trump and Republicans are getting their support are from voters who are more distrustful of institutions and are less frequent and reliable voters. And this pattern is true across age ranges and across ethnicities. And so I actually think Joe Biden's best case scenario this fall would be a lower turnout election where we see a significant drop off in turnout of particularly non-college educated white voters relative to 2020. And the best case scenario for Trump might be that we see a large turnout where a number of voters who aren't that ideological or politically engaged turn out.
And are you seeing indications so far as to whether this should be a high turnout election or a low turnout election?
You know, what I can predict is that the turnout this fall will be closer to 2020 than it was in 2022, but probably not higher than the 160 million Americans who cast ballots in 2020. Keep in mind that when Trump was in the White House, he was the great polarizer. And he not only motivated a lot of Republicans to vote, but he also made Democrats so angry that we had historic levels of turnout on both sides. 159.6 million voters cast ballots that year. We only had 112 million Americans who cast ballots in the midterms when Democrats gained a seat in the Senate and Republicans gained 9 seats in the House. It was basically a wash. And so I think we're going to see between 140 and 155 million Americans turn out this year. And good news for Biden, that's a little bit less than it was in 2020. The good news for Trump is that it's a lot more than it was in 2022. And what we're seeing is that among these less frequent voters, Trump has more of an advantage.
Okay, let's talk about the Manhattan trial now. Have you seen enough polling evidence to convince you that this could have a potentially large impact on the race, especially in the case of a conviction? Or is it starting to look like business as usual to you?
There are a variety of polls that ask voters whether their vote intention would change if Trump were convicted of a crime. And the answer is yes, the polls do change, but by a very slight amount. Now, that slight amount may be all Joe Biden needs in a very, very close election. Even so, Biden is pretty far off the mark of where the polling average was 4 years ago. And what I see when we look at these surveys regarding the trials, voters kind of conflate Trump's legal problems all together. And in a way, it's beneficial to Trump that there are 4 separate indictments that are difficult for voters to keep track of, particularly voters who are not mainlining cable news or paying a lot of attention to political news every day. And in fact, even Democrats would acknowledge that legally, the hush money payments trial in Manhattan is the weakest case against Trump, the one that voters regard as the least serious of the indictments he's been charged with. Even so, it's the only trial that may end up taking place between now and November.
Dave Wasserman, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
The New York hush money trial of former President Trump continues, and the most eye-catching witness has been, without doubt, the former adult film performer known as Stormy Daniels, who's given hours of testimony this week detailing her alleged 2006 sexual encounter with Trump that he continues to deny, but that led to her being paid $130,000 in hush money before the 2016 election. Well, in cross-examination, Trump's defence attorneys have painted Daniels as little better than an extortionist and a prostitute. They accuse her of making up her story about sex with Trump for profit, to which Daniels had a pretty good response, a bit of a zinger, really, that may well stick in the minds of jurors. If that story was untrue, I would have written it to be a lot better. Well, Daniels provided the jury and the media with a lot of salacious testimony this week. Possibly the most damaging, though, came from much friendlier witnesses to Trump, like his former executive assistant and White House Oval Office gatekeeper, Madeleine Westerhout, who gave evidence about the way that Trump continued to pay very close attention to his personal and business finances once he'd become president. Trump continued to sign even small checks personally by hand. And that significance is because it could make it difficult for Trump's defence in the future to argue that he did not know exactly what he was paying his former attorney Michael Cohen for and why he was paying it.
That is undoubtedly true, but people are still just talking about Stormy Daniels. And that is actually potentially a problem, because you're not supposed to introduce evidence that is irrelevant and prejudicial. And so much of what Stormy Daniels said was salacious, as you said, talking about spanking Trump and what Trump said about Ivanka being like Stormy Daniels, etc. Like, that's wonderful news copy, but that's not good for a trial. Let me read you what New York law says about this, okay? It says a court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is outweighed by the danger that its admission would create undue prejudice to a party or to confuse the issues and mislead the jury. And you can so easily see how the jury could think that this trial is about whether he's lying or not about Stormy Daniels. That's not what this trial's about. It's about bookkeeping.
Yes.
That's what this trial is about, right? Yeah. And the problem is, if, like, the judge was awake to this as well. The judge was, like, for a start, the defence didn't want Stormy Daniels to be there at all. But then the judge halfway through said, do we need this much detail?
Yep.
Because it becomes distracting. And also, it potentially stops Trump wanting to testify, because if he gets up there to testify, he's then cross-examined about everything Stormy Daniels talked about.
Yes.
And he's thinking, well, that's the end of this trial.
It's an interesting defence tactic to essentially not be saying, Your Honour, I object, Your Honour, I object every time she says something a little bit personal and intimate. Instead, they kind of wait a few hours and then they say, Can we call a mistrial now?
Yeah.
And the judge a few times have said, look, you've got to object as we go. He's interjecting more than the defence attorneys are right now.
Yeah, look, I think we've established that Trump has terrible lawyers.
Yes.
many times.
Which could be the most brilliant strategy of all.
But I'm not talking about the mistrial thing. That's ridiculous. Yeah. He's not going to get a mistrial. But what he might get is, and the appeals court might, if he gets convicted, they might throw out the conviction because of this. Because they might say he is not going to testify, he didn't testify in his own defence because of this unfair situation. Yeah. And that deprived him of a proper defence. And that happens. That just happened to Harvey Weinstein just now. Yep. His charges and his convictions in New York were thrown out because of exactly that situation.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is that the detail of the affair itself could be relevant to the extent that whether if Trump is lying about the fact that the affair did not happen. If the affair did happen, then that makes him a lot more vulnerable to extortion, blackmail / damaging headlines in 2016 than if she was simply a lying gold digger, which is what his defence is arguing. Still saying this did not happen. Now, if it did not happen, then he can't have been election interfering because, it's who is this person? So I think it still retains some relevance, but we'll see on appeal. You're right.
Yeah. Look. Just to be clear, that I'm not saying she shouldn't have testified. He's saying that the affair didn't happen. She has to testify that it happened.
Yeah.
I just don't think the detail might be useful in the long run.
We'll see about that. Well, for more, we are joined by Professor Anna Cominsky. She's the director of the Criminal Defence Clinic at New York Law School. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So what's your general assessment? What have you made of the prosecution case that has been brought so far in New York? Is it any stronger or weaker than you had expected based on the initial indictments?
I actually think it's pretty consistent with what the indictment suggested. And the reason for that is because they had what we call a speaking indictment, where in addition to the indictment that had the charges in it, they actually provided us with a lot of information about the case that they had presented to the grand jury, which has been quite consistent with what we've seen in front of the jurors. And so nothing really surprising so far.
What do you think is going to be the toughest element that the prosecution are going to need to prove to the jury to make a conviction stick?
By far, the hardest thing for them to do right now, and we have not seen this happen yet, is for them to show intent. So intent is an element, a crucial element of the crimes that Trump is charged with. And so part of what they need to show is that he knew about this, right? He knew about this payment. He knew that these documents were allegedly falsified, and they haven't yet made that connection. So that's really what we're looking for right now. And that's tricky because unless someone says, I did this, that intent, right? That's an operation of the mind that we don't see on the surface. So we need witnesses, we need documents to show that he had that intent, that he had that knowledge.
Professor, we have already seen quite a bit of evidence pointing to the fact that President Trump knew exactly what he was doing in managing his business and personal affairs, signing all the checks still. Is that going to be enough, do you think, to prove intent?
Well, listen, certainly the people who make the decision about whether it's enough are ultimately the jurors, right? And they haven't made that decision yet. But that being said, from what I can tell, what we've seen so far is not enough. There is not that connection. They have not shown every piece of paper to the jury, and they have not yet had someone come in and say, I talked to Trump about this, or Trump talked to me about this, right? And from what we know, we expect that individual to be Michael Cohen, and we have not heard from him yet, and we don't know how credible he will be.
So who do you think has been the most important witness so far for either the prosecution or the defense in order to build their case?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's not, pardon the pun, right? But it's not as sexy as, say, Stormy Daniels. But the individuals who have come in and testified about the documents, Hope Hicks came in and talked about what a crisis this was. These are the people that are actually testifying to the facts that really give credence to the prosecutor's case. Right? We know this is a document case, which means we need to see the documents. And so some of these more, what people might say, these more boring witnesses that have testified so far and have started to introduce the documents, we need those documents. The jury must see those documents in order to make a decision about this case, and in particular, if the prosecutors want a conviction.
So, Professor, beyond confirming that Trump and Stormy Daniels did indeed have an affair, does all the juicy gossip that all the media are talking about have any probative value to the trial at all?
So it actually does. The question is sort of how much of it is necessary, but it does. And the reason is because in order for the prosecutors to get a conviction, in order for the jury to make that determination, they not only have to find that these documents were falsified, but they also have to find that there was an intent to commit another crime. And we know here, based on what the prosecutors have said, that the other crime that they're pointing the jury towards is a conspiracy to unlawfully affect the election. And at its core, that conspiracy, according to the prosecutors, surrounds covering up this alleged affair. And so therefore, they have to have someone testify to the affair itself, and in particular, to some of the details to make it believable that Trump might want to go this far in order to cover it up.
And Professor, President Trump has made it very clear that he would like to take the stand in this trial, and he's clearly chafing under the gag orders, not that it's entirely stopped him, of course. Were you his defense attorney? Would you be encouraging him to take the stand or not?
Well, what I would say is I certainly wouldn't be advising him before I've seen all of the prosecution's case, right? The burden lies with the prosecutors. They have the burden of proof. The defendant does not have to testify, and in fact has a right not only to choose whether or not to testify, but also for the jury to be instructed that they may not hold it against him if he does testify. Certainly in a case like this, it's dangerous water for the defendant to testify, as it is in all cases. But it's sort of yet to be seen what the right decision would be, what the smart decision would be, because we haven't seen the prosecution's entire case.
And how do you think the judge should be handling Trump's repeated breaches of the gag order? Clearly, in a political sense, it seems like he wouldn't mind being packed off to Rikers Island for a few nights. Would the judge be wise to be putting that in his mind, that this is maybe something the defendant actually wants?
The gag order is a real distraction for the defense in particular. Trying a case of this magnitude is exhausting. It's time consuming. It takes literally every part of your being as a defense attorney and a prosecutor for that matter. But as a defense attorney, when you're in trial, that's all you're doing is eating, sleeping, and breathing the case. And something like having to deal with your client and potential other issues, ancillary issues, is a time suck. It really affects your ability to focus on the issues of the case. So, you know, with respect to this gag order, whether the judge would actually send him to Rikers, the judges certainly indicated that that is a possibility. Whether that will happen, we just don't know yet.
Professor Anna Cominsky, thank you for having a fireside chat with us.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. We will be back with Planet America Wednesday night, 10 p.m. on ABC TV and anytime from 9 p.m. on ABC iView.
And do not forget the Planet America Extra Podcast, PEP, in all the usual pod places right there.
Bye-bye.